Okay, so welcome back to the DribZ kitchen. The first step in smoking a brisket, in fact, the place where you'll actually make or break your brisket is in the trim. The trim is the hardest part about smoking a brisket, if you were to ask me, because it goes against your instincts. Your instinct is you want to keep as much meat as possible, and the reality is when you're trimming a brisket, you actually have to be merciless. The leaving things on that you even the slightest bit questionable about is going to ruin part of your brisket. So today we're going to show you how to trim and spice your brisket, and then we'll move on to the next stage, which is smoking. So we have in front of us what we call a whole packer brisket. Packer means that it includes the flat and the point. Okay, doesn't mean that it's bigger or smaller than any other brisket. It just means that you have both the lean section and the fatty section all in one part of the brisket. So in order to begin, we're going to start, this is the fatty side, the side with most of the fat on, but we're actually going to start on the bottom side of the brisket. So on a whole pack of brisket, on the bottom you're going to notice there's like small layers of silver skin. And what you want to do is just kind of get your knife in there underneath the layers and make tiny little trims. You don't have to get it all off, but you do want it to look a little bit prettier than it does now. So you want to kind of get off this skin, and the reason you want to get a fair amount of this skin off is so that your spices can seep through into the meat when you do the spicing phase. So we're just going to do like so. You don't have to get it all off, but we want to get, a fair amount in each section so that we know, like, when we put salt on the beef, it's going to seep all the way through to the lower layer. Okay, now, you will see little chunkies of fat. Those can come off. On every pack of brisket, on the fatty side, there is this fat chunk, okay? This is called the heel of the brisket. And what it is it's hard fat, okay? So in a brisket, there's soft fat, which is the fat we love, and there's hard fat, which we cannot do with. Hard fat will not melt. It will not sort of slowly melt and become part of this brisket, making it juicy and more delicious. So we want to get rid of that hard fat. So what we're going to do, I'm going to take a bigger knife here, and this is going to look like a lot. Don't be scared, okay? We're going to cut down off the point. We're going to cut around here, and we're going to pull off all this crazy hard fat, okay? That. Now, if you want to know why brisket is so expensive, the reason is that from what we buy from our meat supplier, we actually probably end up keeping, I'd say 60%. We lose 70%. We lose 30 to 40% in the trim, making sure that we have a beautiful aerodynamic brisket that's not going to have horrible bits and pieces. The other thing you want to keep in mind when you're trimming your brisket is you want a uniform shape. The more uniform the shape, when the heat comes from the smoker, you want it to slowly fold over. You don't want it to catch on an edge. If it catches on an edge, what that means is that the heat is going to burn that edge, and what's behind that edge is not really going to cook as quickly. So you're going to clean off all these like little edges that stick out until you have a beautiful rounded product. Now here, look at this. You see this? This is very skinny. Can you see this edge of thing? This is way too thin. We're cooking this brisket for 12 hours. You can't have anything that thin over 12 hours. It's not going to stand up to the heat. So we are going to cut a rounded edge all the way along here, trying to get a little bit of a thicker cut, right? And we're going to trim off that edge so it's nice and round, and we're going to trim off that corner so it's nice and round. Okay? Yeah. Okay. So we've now done most of the bottom side of this brisket. As I said, you're not going to get all that silver skin off, but we've done the majority, which means that when we put salt and spice onto this brisket, it's going to sink into the meat, which is what we really want. Like silver skin is kind of like a saran wrap, stopping things coming through. We've also rounded it so that it's got a nice sort of uniform shape. You can see it's kind of oval in shape. It's got a little point here, but that point's fine. That's what that's going to do is when the heat hits it, it's going to open it up and go all around the edges. we're now going to go on the fatty side, just to make sure. Now, American briskets, like what you see in the States, normally come with a much thicker layer of fat. Israeli briskets, or what they bring into the country, are going to have a much thinner layer of fat. So you actually have very little trimming to do on the fatty side. You want to leave at least kind of a half to a quarter inch of fat on the brisket, because that's going to protect it from the heat and it's going to melt into the meat, making it beautiful and tender. So all we're really going to do here is just kind of do a little bit of trimming on the sides, just making it a little bit pretty, pulling off any sort of scraggly bits so that we've got a nice pretty brisket when it goes on the smoker. There's a tiny edge here that I don't like, and bagadon, that looks beautiful. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to spice this brisket. We'll be back in a sec. Okay, so first of all these offcuts, people think never throw these away. These are great. You make them to burgers, into chopped meat. This is some of the best beef that you could use. It's just no good for cooking brisket, but it's got a great amount. Like in a perfect burger, you want sort of 70% lean, 30% fatty, and that is the perfect ratio on a brisket. Like, I would never throw this away. Okay, so here's our brisket, and we are now going to spice it. So we're going to start backside down, and the thing about spicing a brisket is this: there's a few methods and there's a few kind of theories. The classic Texas style says salt and pepper. I used to do that, but I don't really believe that anymore. So we've made up our own sort of blend. So in this, we have equal parts salt, like kosher salt, ground black pepper, garlic powder, cumin, and a little bit of like any store-bought barbecue spice. But that's probably the least of what's in here. Majority of it is salt, pepper, garlic powder, and cumin. So some people use a binder, which means that they'll put down like mustard or oil on the brisket. You can do that if your brisket's dry, if it's come out of the fridge. Like if you've had it open in the fridge for a couple of hours, it's going to be dry and the spice mixture is not going to stick. But if your brisket's wet out of the pack, like we just opened ours, you don't need a binder. It's just going to muddle the flavors. I don't see a need to recommend it. So what we want to do is we're just going to put a nice, really, really, really thick layer of spice. You want it. This is a huge piece of meat. I mean, this is like, 6-7 kilos. It can handle a lot of salt, a lot of pepper. So you don't want to be stingy. And also, absolutely do not forget the edges. You really want the edges. So you
spice it on both sides?
Yeah, we're going to do the second side in a second. But the first thing you do is spice the underside. And I'll show you why we're going to wait a second between the underside and the top side before we do the top side. So we're just making sure these edges get a nice amount of salt and pepper, nice amount of spice, and this is all going to sink in. And this spice is not just for flavoring. People think that you spice it to flavor the brisket, but the reality is that there is a chemical reaction between the salt, the spices, the nitrates in the salt, and the smoke from the charcoal and the wood. And that chemical reaction is what creates the bark. So it turns black and it creates inside that beautiful pink smoke ring. But it's more about the bark. Really, half the flavor in your brisket is that bark, that outside black, toasty, chunky deliciousness. And you need a thick layer of spice to produce it. We're going to leave this spice on the bottom layer for about 5 minutes to set. And then we're going to flip it. So we want that salt and those spices to sink in before we do the other side. Okay, so we have done the one side. We've left that for a couple of minutes just to set. And now we are going to spice the top side. Same as before. We want a nice thick layer of spice. But this side can be even thicker than the first one because most of that fat is going to render and sort of, melt. So a lot of that spice is going to come off. But you want, especially on the exposed meat, you want nice amounts of salt so that it sinks into the meat and really flavors the meat. the one thing there's just one thing I wanted to point out to you guys, because it's really, really important and it's going to make a big difference to your briskets. You see this like little lip here? This like thing.
Flap.
So this flap is the top of the decal, and underneath that there's a thick band of fat. A lot of people spend a lot of time scooping out that fat. In my opinion, don't do that. That fat renders beautifully, and it protects this little sort of flap layer of meat. If after you've cooked it, you see that there's still a thick band of fat and it hasn't rendered out, then you can always cut it off and think. But what it does is it creates this beautiful moist chunk on the top that you can use for your burnt ends, that you can use as like a beautiful fatty piece. But without that fat protecting it, this part will dry out. So leave that fat underneath this like little lump. You see all this fat? Leave that in there. It's going to render, and even if it doesn't, you'll cut it off, but it's going to make this piece one of the best parts of the brisket.
Is that controversial, or do people leave?
It's not really controversial. Your butcher, if you ask your butcher to trim your brisket for you, he's going to pull that out because he thinks that you don't want that. But most people don't realize, most people aren't cooking a 12-hour brisket.
But do most pitmaster, whatever you call them, smoker people, do they?
Most pitmasters, there's two schools of thought. One is they shave off this entire chunk so that you've got a completely flat sort of product, and the other is you leave in that fat band and you keep it moist. I personally love this piece. I think it's one of the best pieces. Okay, so this has been spiced. We're going to put it in the fridge for about 12 hours. So it's really going to pick up the flavors from that salt, that pepper, that garlic, that cumin, bit of chili from the barbecue spice. And in about 12 hours time, we're going to put it on the pit and we're going to smoke it. So it was lovely seeing you for now. Now you know how to trim and spice a brisket. The next step will be smoking.